Hello, y'all, and welcome back to the channel. Marquita here, and today I'm going to be doing a book review or a couple of book reviews, and also sharing with you what I have coming up in my book collection that I'll be reading and eventually reviewing. So I know it's been a while since I've done quite a few reviews. I did just do one on internment, so I'll go ahead and put the card up for that one if you haven't seen it already. That was the last book. It was a young adult novel. And so now I'm going to get into another book that I read along with what I'm reading right now and tell you a little bit about those. And of course, I'll be back to review them. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'll go ahead and start with the last book that I completely finished, and that was Spare by Prince Harry. So you guys know that there has been a lot of scandal involving Harry and Meghan. For whatever reason, people seem to have such a big issue with Meghan. But hey, as a person of color, we already know how that goes. But it seems to be that since they pulled away from the royal family, he was able to express kind of his side of the story, because we already know, if you aren't familiar with the royal family, they actually have press that is specifically assigned to the royal family, and they are in charge of spinning these stories about the royal family that can either make them, likable in the eye of the public, or if something goes wrong, the palace can say, hey, let's put things out here where people do not like this particular person. And as strange as that sounds, you will see that if you look up any information about like the press that is specifically affiliated with the royal family, there are certain people who are like, that's their assignment, that's their job. No different than like we have White House correspondents or whatnot, where they are specifically assigned to report on White House news. Same type of thing with the royals. It seems to be that when it came to Meghan in particular, when negative things were coming out that they didn't necessarily approve or necessarily say put out, they also didn't offer a defense when it was something that was untrue or maybe partially true, where they just kind of split out a piece of the story and not the whole thing, where it made Meghan look bad or gave a negative light to her or her family. And so Harry had an issue with that, and that kind of led to, eventually him seeing and remembering his mother's life and how things went with her, and he just didn't want to repeat that same cycle, because he was starting to see those things appear happen with Meghan and the pressures and how it was impacting her. And as a good husband should, he decided to do what was best for his family and also to protect his wife, not only her honor, but also for her mental and emotional health as well. So, of course, he releases this book called Spare, and the title itself is very telling, because it goes on to explain how, he is the second child, or the youngest. It's him and his brother. His older brother, Prince William, would essentially be the next in line for the throne after their father, because he was the firstborn son. And so then would come Harry. He's the spare, essentially. But now that William has, children of his own, and he has a son, his son would actually be next in line before. So you have those types of things going on. But Harry is referred to as the spare, because in the event that, say, something would have, happened to Prince William, when they were coming up, or even now, if something were to happen to him, he would be the next person. He would be, he would have been the next in line, per se. So that's why he was considered like the spare. Like, they were grooming and raising William to be that person, to be the next king, or to have that role or that type of power. But Harry was kind of like a background singer, per se. Like, he was there, and yes, he's still a prince, yes, he was royal, but it was like, you're not next, so you're not the one that we're focusing as much on. He did get similar education and whatnot as his brother, but the focus was, we want to make sure that William has all the components to be the next king, because that's our focus. And so that's why Harry was often referred to as the spare. And he even mentions in the story that his father said that shortly after he was born, when Diana had him, that like, oh, we have a spare. So he always felt like he was, just kind of like not an afterthought, but just kind of like, I'm not the one, I'm not the chosen one, per se. And so he tells his story, and I think to me it was a great book. I actually read it, or downloaded on via Audible, and he is the narrator for Terry is the narrator for his story. And I love when people who wrote their books, when they are the ones that are the narrators as well. So it was really like him telling his story. And so one of the things, or I guess I could say one of the parts of the book that impacted me the most was when he talks about the death of his mother. And we know that he was still relatively young when she passed away. And there was a scandal about him crying when they were walking behind the casket. And I remember when, I heard about that and how they talked about, they made it such a big deal, and they were saying how he essentially broke protocol because royals aren't supposed to, cry or show real emotion like that in public. And I remember I was, a young child myself, and I was thinking, what's wrong with that? Like, why is it bad for a child to be crying? Like, I was like, that's his mother. Like, why shouldn't he cry? Like, that's normal. And so he even talks about how, that situation and how people, made such a big deal over it. And it's just like, do we forget that, yeah, they're royal and essentially, I guess you could say they're special or whatnot in that sense. But at the end of the day, he's still a human being, and he's a child that lost his mother. No matter what your title is or where you stand in society, like, that's your mother and you lost her. So the fact that that was such, looked at so harshly, that just gives you an insight. And that was kind of like his first real taste of what being a royal, like that type of lifestyle, what that's going to mean for him. Because I don't think, other than paparazzi and all that kind of stuff, that was just kind of day to day, they were used to that. But I think that was the first insight to where it's like every little thing you do is criticized and judged, even when it's normal human behavior. It's like, so I can't be a human, I can't show real emotion without it being an issue or getting some kind of backlash. And so there are other events in his life where he talked about, as teenagers, when teenagers grow up and they party and, they go out and they get, they might get drunk or experiment with drugs or whatever in the high school and college days. Like, that's teenage behavior. Like, that's not anything super crazy. But because he was who he was, again, it was scrutinized. It was all on the front page of the paper, all of those types of things. So he just talks about what it's like kind of growing up and trying to have like as much of a normal life as possible with, every little thing that you do that's not 100% perfect and expected of you when you go outside of that box, like how that impacts you. And you can just imagine how that takes a toll on you mentally and emotionally. And so I think the part of the book that was most touching was when he did talk about his mother, outside of the crying piece. But he talked about how in his head, for the longest time, he kind of told himself like she wasn't really dead. Like, not that he was wouldn't necessarily say he was in denial, but he felt like she was playing a trick to some extent. Like, when they were actually going through the service, and he talked about when she was actually, being buried, when they were putting the casket, in the ground and whatnot. He was thinking like, we're having this service and everybody's, sad and crying and the emotional whatever is there. But he was like, she's not really, all these people, they're making all this big deal and she's not in there. Like, my mom's not in that. She's not really in that casket. Like, she's hiding. This is all like fake, because we know that sometimes, the media would spin stories just so people could, get away or do whatever. And so he kind of felt like she had run off because at that time, she was already split from their father, from now King Charles. They were already split up and she was dating. And so I believe that they had a place in Paris. And so he was saying like, oh, like mom has gone here, like she's just hiding to get away from the media or whatever. So she had to fake her death in order to kind of get out of the royal spotlight, paparazzi, all of that. Because even after they split up, they were still hounding her. So hence, what happened to her. And so he was, for a while, like that's how he processed it, as, my mom's not really dead. She's just, hiding right now. She's playing a trick. She's playing a game or whatnot. So I thought that was very interesting and a little bit sad how, because of the way their life was, he wasn't really able to truly process grief probably the way that you would want a child to be able to process, losing a parent or whatnot, because he didn't really have anybody there to just kind of help him go through the stages of grief. Like, everybody was just kind of like, this is how you act and this happened and we're gonna move on. Like, even when his father told him what happened, told him, his brother, what happened to their mother, it was just kind of like a formality. Like, he told her, it wasn't a lot of emotion, it wasn't a lot of comfort, and the way like you would expect the other parent to comfort a young child when you tell them that their other parent is now, dead and has passed away in a tragic accident, very unexpected situation. So I think that was also telling, when he didn't even realize at the time, because again, you get used to that's just the way of life and how people respond and behave. But now that he's an adult and a father of children himself, he's looking back and reflecting on events in his life and certain moments of his childhood, and he's starting to realize like how those things, what was lacking, and how it wasn't necessarily, he's not necessarily blaming his father and saying like, oh, you're a horrible parent or whatever, but he's just kind of putting everything into perspective to say like, this was how I was raised, and these are the things. Now having his own children and seeing how he is with his children, he's realizing what he didn't have, as a child growing up, and what he was missing emotionally from his father. Not so much his mother, because his mother did try to be as much of a normal mom as possible given the situation. She was very protective of her children, and she did try to raise them to be good, normal, people. And I think you do see that in both of them, even though it seems like his brother isn't able to exude that quite as much because of his position. I think it really impacted Harry the most, and personally I've always been a fan of Harry, even when he was young. And I really think that the grandmother, the queen, actually somewhere in there, that was her baby, because she spoke out when people came for him for crying, because again, he was a young child. And so she actually spoke up in his defense, I believe, and she did mention the fact that, he was a young boy and that was his mother. And so that to me was enough to say, like, grandma, that's grandma's baby. And anybody that knows like that term, when you say like grandma's baby, you don't mess with grandma's baby like that. But overall, I thought it was a, great book if you really are interested in knowing more about Harry, because he does focus a lot on himself. He does talk about, his experience coming up, and then he does mention his other family members as it relates to him, and it's from his perspective of experiences that he went through. So if you are interested in him, if you're interested, it talks about everything, and I thought it was really cute when he even talked about his time in the army. He talks about how his other serious relationships prior to Megan, and how those kind of helped shape him to be where he is and what he wanted, and how his lifestyle in terms of being, a royal and paparazzi and all that, and how that actually impacted some of his relationships. And so I think if you really want to get to know the real Harry and really know who he is as a person, then this would be a great book. So I would highly recommend it. I found it, again, I was listening to it on Audible. I didn't purchase the hard copy of the book, but I do think it is a good book. And I think if you really want insight on the royal life, like a true story, or more of a true insight versus what you see in the media, then you should also read the book, because he does give a lot of insight on just kind of a day-to-day life, of growing up like that. I'm currently reading Janelle Monáe's book, and this is called The Memory Librarian and Other Stories of Dirty Computer. And if you saw my recent Target haul, you know that I picked up this book along with a couple others that I'm going to talk about in just a moment. But so far, I'm diving into this book, and I am enjoying it. It's very different than some of the other books that I've read in a long time. It does kind of fall under the sci-fi category, but it's also like a futuristic sci-fi. And I know sci-fi in general tends to be futuristic, but it's also, it really does have those components of futuristic situation here. And of course, yes, this is Janelle Monáe, the artist as well, the musical artist. So if you're familiar with her, yes, it's the same person. And this was her first book. It was written in 2019, I believe, and it is a New York Times bestseller. So I'm currently reading, and I am about 70 pages in. And right now we're introduced to a character named Sishat. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. And she is the memory librarian, like that is her position. And so we're in a time where there is still an environment, but things, it's kind of like they're monitoring our thoughts. Like there's a bigger system, I guess you could say. I guess you would compare it to like government. So the librarians kind of house your memories, and what they do is they kind of scan and monitor people's memories and thoughts and whatnot to make sure that there's no signs of deviance. And deviance can be referred to, it could even be something as far as sexuality. So like people that would be considered members of the LGBTQ plus community, like that would be a sign of deviance. It doesn't mean that you can't necessarily live there, but what they're essentially trying to do is almost like a dystopian situation where you want your people to be a certain way, and so you create this environment where everybody is there, but you still have that hierarchy of like your elite and all of that, and based on your social status, again, depends on types of jobs and all of that. But just like anywhere else, you do have those people who are what they call deviants, and those things are indicated by your number. So people don't have names per se anymore. Like they do have names, but you have a number affiliated with it, and your numbering kind of gives your identity in terms of whether or not you're a deviant or what type of person you are. So like, for example, you might have a name that's like Jack 36789 or whatever, and that 89 might mean, oh, Jack's a deviant, or he has been flagged before for having deviant activity or whatever. And so the way they do that is they basically wipe your memory, and you kind of get a fresh start. So you don't remember certain things, but they house it. So they do have it available, but it's like you have these headsets. So I'm visualizing when they talk about headsets, kind of like those virtual reality headsets that we put on. But basically they have these headsets, and you essentially sync your memories to this system, which is kind of like, it would be like the government to the memory library, essentially. And so they're able to kind of monitor. And so they don't necessarily look at every single person's memories, but what it does is it flags certain things. So if something comes up, if a memory comes through that has like a certain thing, something in it that might be considered, a red flag or whatever, it'll flag it. And then they start monitoring you for deviant activity to see if you're doing any deviant activity or whatnot. So that's kind of how it goes. And they allow you to live like in certain areas, kind of based, or function in certain areas kind of based on where you fall within that. So it's a very interesting situation. And so Sishat is has met this woman, and she's learning more about her right now. Her name is Alethea, and she's learning more about Alethea, and she's also Sishat's a love interest right now. And so she's starting to find out some things about her, and I think that Alethea is going to end up kind of helping Sishat find herself, because within this book, even though it is kind of like futuristic, whatever, we are getting some of the same like racism and feminism and all of those things within the futuristic thing, because Sishat is a person of color, and she has this powerful position as the memory librarian. And so that's not being a woman and a woman of color, she's also dealing with people who are not necessarily happy that she's in that position. And so it kind of goes on to show, like, even with everything else, having this big powerful position, all that, even in the future with this futuristic situation, we still deal with those issues in the society. No matter what type of society you form, those issues seem to still be in play in some way. So you kind of see that play out in the book. And like I said, I'm not that far along in it, but so far so good. I definitely will see it as a book that I'm going to keep reading and finish. So you will see a full review on this once I'm done. Next up are the last two books are books I have picked up, and again, they were mentioned in my Target haul as well, but I have not started reading these. But I just wanted to show you, like, they'll be next up behind the Memory Librarian. I have Take My Hand, and this one is by Dolan Perkins Valdez. And this particular story takes place in Montgomery, Alabama in 1973. That's where it starts. The main character, whose name is Civil, like Civil War, Civil Townsend, she intends to make a difference, especially in her African American community, at the Montgomery Family Planning Clinic, similar to like a Planned Parenthood. She hopes to help women shape their destinies to make their own choices for their lives and bodies. So she's a nurse, and she's going into this particular field, and she's working at a clinic, and she kind of has a goal because, again, it's the Deep South in the early 70s, so we still are dealing with racial relations and all of that, but her goal is to be able to help people in her community, because we know even today, unfortunately, there is a big disparity between healthcare in Black and brown communities compared to a white community, and also compared to wealthy communities versus poor or lower income communities, which tend to house more people from black and brown backgrounds. Also, not just the lack of access and availability of healthcare, but also just having people in the healthcare field that look like you. So that's kind of her story. She's wanting to do this from one perspective, and then Civil, she works in that career as a nurse, and then she goes on. One of her first assignments, she gets assigned. She has to go visit a house with a poor family, and they have a daughter, and that's who she's going to see. And so they don't actually say like what happens, not in the summary. I haven't read it yet, but not in the summaries. But the two girls that she is dealing with are 11 and 13, and so that's kind of a red flag to her that they're dealing with some kind of situation that would involve family planning with girls that young. So yeah, that was her first kind of red flag, and so that's one of those things that just stays with her throughout her career. You know how sometimes you might have an experience in your profession, no matter what it is, where it just kind of stays with you. You never forget it. And it can be a positive or a negative experience, but you remember it for some reason. It really puts an imprint on you, and it may even impact how you function going forward in that position or within that company or role. So that's kind of what happens with her in this situation. And so then we fast forward to, she fast forwards into now she is older, and she has a daughter of her own who is now grown. And so now Civil is ready to retire. And so at this point, there are things that tend to come back. She's still haunted by those early situations. Like the two girls' names are Erica and India. So those two 11 and 13-year-old girls, like she still can't forget them, even though she's almost done with her career. She's at the point of retirement. That still bothered, something about that situation still bothered her. And so it sounds like eventually that's going to come back around in some way. Of course, they would be grown by now at this point, but something comes back around. And so she said that history repeats what we don't remember. And so I don't know how, I predict that maybe those same two girls will have children of their own, and maybe they will cross paths again with Civil in some way, or maybe even her daughter will have some kind of connection with them. So I feel like they are going to cross paths again later in life. And so that's how I think the story is going to come back around. But this particular book is based on or inspired by some true events that actually happened. So I love books like that. So while this particular story is, fiction, it is based on real events. Also a Target purchase, and it's a book club purchase as well. And the last book that I have here is In the Time of Our History. And this one is by Suzanne Perry. Also a Target book club purchase. And as I mentioned before, those Target book club books are signed by the author, which is why I purchased them as well. Copies of them, hard copies. So this particular book is about a multi-generational situation, and we have a culture clash or a mix of cultures here. We have American culture, and then we also have in the book, we also have Iranian culture. So her family are Iranian. Her dad's Iranian. Her mom is white. So you have the American and Iranian. And we know culturally kind of like the roles and the expectations of of women in Iranian society. So the dad is trying to impose this on his daughters. He has 2 daughters, and one daughter is following in that path. Like she is going that way. She's what the dad would want and expect. And then you have the other sister who is kind of like, she's more Americanized, and so she's wanting to follow in that path, and it causes a rift between her and her family. And the mom is kind of in the middle, because at the end of the day, those are her children, but then she's also trying to, I think, honor her husband and understand where he's coming from with that culture. So you just have those 2 things happen. Something ends up happening to the sister that does follow in the path, and so she ends up dying, and the sister who was kind of estranged from her family comes back into the picture, for the funeral and whatnot. And so then they're trying to rekindle a little something, like due to the sister's death. They're trying to, I guess, like make up for lost time, or kind of trying to rebuild something. But again, that clash continues, because you still have the dad with his beliefs and backgrounds, and then you have the daughter who is trying to do her own thing in a more American life. They found out some things that happened within the sister's life that they weren't aware of until after her death. So you have all of that coming in, and this is also kind of based on true story, whereas the author is also a mixture of cultures as well. And so this is, while this story again is not her story, it has the components of things that she experienced in her life, because again, she is someone of I believe she is American and Iranian. Yes, she was born in New Jersey to an Iranian father and American mother. Grew up in both the U.S. and Iran until the 1979 Iranian Revolution. So that's the author here. So then her family was in permanent exile. If you guys don't know anything about that Islamic revolution that happened along those times, I would highly recommend a book called Persepolis. It is a graphic novel. So again, comic book if you're not familiar with the term graphic novel. And I also have one other book that I have on my Audible, which is Black Girls Must Die Exhausted. That is a 3-part series. That's the first book in the series, so I look forward to getting that one up and running. I'll probably get that one started and be reading it along with the Memory Librarian. So those 2 will probably be coming up next in my reviews. But until then, you can check out my playlist with my previous reviews. And also I did include my latest review, which was of Internment, a YA novel about a society similar to something like the Holocaust, but it's happening here in the US, and the targets are people who identify as Muslim. So if you read any of these books, or if you have any suggestions, please feel free to put them in the comments. Until then, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Please be sure to like and subscribe.